My sister smashed my 6-year-old daughter's new bicycle with a hammer in front of her. And when she started crying, my niece went next to her and hit her head with a hammer while saying, "Stop whining, if you don't get the bicycle then no one gets it." And that's when my daughter lost consciousness. When I confronted her saying, "What kind of daughter do you have? Look what she did." My parents rushed in taking my niece away while my daughter lay down not moving at all. Mom said, "Some children just play too rough sometimes." That's when I called 911 and what I did next left them in ruins. My name is Claire, and I'm a 34-year-old single mother to the most beautiful little girl in the world, Sophie. What I'm about to tell you will probably make your blood boil, but I need to get this off my chest because the justice that followed was so sweet, I still smile thinking about it. Let me start from the beginning. My sister Nicole has always been the golden child in our family. She's 2 years older than me, married to a successful lawyer named Michael, and they have one daughter together, my niece Isabella, who's 8 years old. Growing up, Nicole could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. When she got pregnant at 19 and dropped out of college, it was a blessing in disguise. When I got pregnant at 28 after a brief relationship that didn't work out, it was irresponsible and shameful. The double standards were always there, but I learned to live with them for the sake of family peace. Nicole and I had a complicated relationship, but I tried to keep things civil for Sophie's sake. I wanted my daughter to know her aunt and cousin, despite the tension that sometimes arose between us. Nicole had always been competitive with me, even as adults. If I bought Sophie a new dress, Nicole would show up the next week with a more expensive one for Isabella. If I took Sophie to Disney World, Nicole would plan a European vacation. It was exhausting, but I thought it was harmless sibling rivalry. The problems really started escalating about 6 months before the incident, as I now call it. Sophie had been asking for a bicycle for months. She'd seen other kids in our neighborhood riding around and desperately wanted to join them. As a single mother working as a dental hygienist, money was tight, but I'd been saving up for months to buy her the perfect bike for her 6th birthday. I wanted it to be special, something she'd remember forever. I found the most beautiful pink and purple bicycle with streamers on the handlebars, a little basket in front, and training wheels that could be removed when she was ready. It cost me nearly $400, which was a huge expense for me, but seeing Sophie's face when she unwrapped it made every penny worth it. She literally screamed with joy and hugged me so tight I thought she might break my ribs. It was one of those perfect parenting moments that make all the struggle worthwhile. The plan was simple: we'd have Sophie's birthday party at my parents' house, where there was more space and a big backyard for the kids to play. Sophie was so excited to show off her new bike to everyone, especially Isabella, who she looked up to despite their age difference. I should have known something was wrong when Nicole's face fell the moment she saw the bicycle. She made some comment about it being awfully fancy for such a young child and how Isabella had outgrown such childish things. But I brushed it off. This was Sophie's day, and I wasn't going to let Nicole's jealousy ruin it. The party went well initially. Sophie rode her bike around the backyard while the other kids cheered and asked for turns. She was generous and happy, letting everyone try it out while staying close to supervise. I remember feeling so proud of her maturity and kindness. Isabella seemed particularly interested in the bike, asking detailed questions about where I bought it and how much it cost. I should have seen the warning signs, but I was just happy the girls were getting along. About an hour into the party, I went inside to help my mom with the cake. Sophie had left her bike parked by the back porch, and most of the kids were playing on the swing set. I was in the kitchen for maybe 10 minutes when I heard Sophie screaming. Not the normal playground scream of excitement, but a blood-curdling shriek of pure terror and anguish. I ran outside and froze in absolute horror. Nicole was standing over Sophie's beautiful new bicycle with a hammer in her hands, smashing it to pieces. The handlebars were bent at impossible angles, the wheels were completely destroyed, and the pretty pink frame was dented beyond repair. Sophie was standing about 5 feet away, sobbing hysterically and begging her aunt to stop. The other children had backed away and were crying too, clearly traumatized by what they were witnessing. But that wasn't even the worst part. While I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing, Isabella calmly walked over to Sophie, who was now on her knees crying over the remains of her bicycle. My 8-year-old niece looked down at my sobbing 6-year-old daughter and said, "Clear as day, stop whining. If you don't get the bicycle, then no one gets it." And then Isabella picked up a piece of the broken bike frame and struck Sophie in the head with it. I still have nightmares about the sound. The metallic thud of the metal frame connecting with my baby's skull. Sophie's cries stopped immediately, and she crumpled to the ground like a rag doll. Her little body went completely limp, and I could see blood starting to seep through her blonde hair. I screamed and ran to Sophie, dropping to my knees beside her motionless form. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. The other children were screaming now, and I could hear parents rushing over from inside the house. But instead of helping, instead of calling for medical attention, Nicole just stood there with the hammer still in her hands, looking annoyed rather than horrified. "Nicole, what the hell is wrong with you?" I screamed, cradling Sophie's limp body. "What kind of daughter do you have? Look what she did to Sophie." That's when my parents came rushing out. But instead of immediately calling for help or checking on Sophie, my father rushed to Isabella and picked her up, carrying her away from the scene. My mother looked down at Sophie, who was still unconscious with blood matting her hair, and said the words that still make my blood boil to this day: "Some children just play too rough sometimes. I'm sure Sophie will be fine." Play too rough? My daughter had been assaulted with a weapon and was lying unconscious, and my mother thought it was just rough play? That's when something in me snapped. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 while still holding Sophie in my arms. "I need an ambulance and police immediately," I said, giving them our address. "My 6-year-old daughter has been assaulted with a hammer and is unconscious. The perpetrator is still on scene." Nicole finally seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. "Claire, don't be dramatic. It was just an accident. Kids fight over toys all the time." "An accident?" There was nothing accidental about what I had witnessed. Nicole had deliberately destroyed Sophie's bicycle, and then her daughter had deliberately hit Sophie in the head with a hammer. This was assault, plain and simple. The ambulance arrived within minutes, followed closely by 2 police officers. As the paramedics worked on Sophie, checking her vitals and carefully examining her head wound, the officers took statements from everyone present. The other parents who had witnessed the incident were horrified and gave detailed accounts of what they'd seen. Several of them had actually recorded parts of it on their phones, thinking initially that they were capturing cute birthday party moments. Sophie was rushed to the hospital with a severe concussion and a hairline fracture in her skull. I rode in the ambulance with her, holding her little hand and praying to every deity I could think of that she would be okay. The doctors said she was lucky, a few centimeters in a different direction, and the blow could have caused permanent brain damage or even death. While Sophie was in the hospital, the police were conducting their investigation. They interviewed all the witnesses, reviewed the phone recordings, and examined the hammers that had been used. It turned out that Nicole had brought the hammers from her garage specifically for this purpose. She had planned this attack on Sophie's bicycle, and by extension, on Sophie herself. The charges came down like a hammer blow of justice. Nicole was charged with destruction of property, child endangerment, and assault. Isabella, being only 8, couldn't be charged criminally, but Child Protective Services opened an investigation into her home environment. The question everyone was asking was, what kind of household produces a child who thinks hitting someone in the head with a hammer is an appropriate response to jealousy? But I wasn't satisfied with just the criminal charges. Sophie had medical bills that my insurance only partially covered, she'd need therapy to deal with the trauma, and she'd lost something precious that could never be replaced, her sense of safety within our own family. I consulted with a personal injury attorney, and we decided to pursue a civil lawsuit against Nicole and Michael for assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligence. This is where the story gets really satisfying. During the discovery process for the lawsuit, we uncovered some interesting information about Nicole and Michael's finances. It turned out that Michael's law practice wasn't as successful as everyone believed. They were heavily in debt, had taken out multiple mortgages on their house, and were barely keeping their heads above water financially. All of Nicole's expensive purchases and lavish lifestyle were funded by credit cards and loans they couldn't afford. The criminal trial came first. Nicole tried to claim that she'd had a mental breakdown, that she'd been struggling with depression and anxiety, and that she wasn't thinking clearly when she destroyed Sophie's bicycle. Her lawyer painted her as a victim of circumstances, a struggling mother who had simply snapped under pressure. But the prosecution had those phone recordings. Clear video evidence of Nicole calmly and methodically destroying a child's bicycle while that child begged her to stop. There was nothing spontaneous or uncontrolled about her actions. She had brought the hammer specifically for this purpose, and she had watched approvingly as her daughter struck mine in the head with another hammer. The jury didn't buy Nicole's sob story for a second. They saw right through her crocodile tears and her lawyer's attempts to paint her as the victim. She was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 2 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay restitution for Sophie's medical bills and the destroyed bicycle. But the civil lawsuit was where I really got my revenge. Our attorney was brilliant. He didn't just focus on the immediate damages from the assault. He brought in child psychologists who testified about the long-term trauma that Sophie would likely experience. He had medical experts explain the severity of her injuries and the potential complications she could face as she grew older. He even brought in economists who calculated the future therapy costs and the potential impact on Sophie's earning capacity if she suffered any lasting cognitive effects. The jury in the civil case was furious. Here was a successful lawyer and his wife, living in a fancy house and driving expensive cars, who had brutally assaulted a 6-year-old child over jealousy about a bicycle. The optics were terrible for Nicole and Michael, and their own attorneys seemed embarrassed to be representing them. The jury awarded Sophie and me $2.3 million in damages. The breakdown was roughly $300,000 for medical expenses and future therapy costs, $500,000 for pain and suffering, $500,000 for emotional distress, and $1 million in punitive damages designed to punish Nicole and Michael for their outrageous conduct. When the verdict was read, I watched Nicole's face turn white as a sheet. Michael actually put his head in his hands and started sobbing. Their attorney looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Meanwhile, Sophie was sitting beside me in the courtroom, coloring in a book while wearing her protective helmet. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense that something important had occurred. The local media picked up the story after the verdict, and it became a sensation. "Aunt attacks niece with hammer over birthday bike" was a headline that ran in newspapers across the state. The story went viral on social media, with thousands of people expressing outrage at Nicole's actions and support for Sophie and me. Several strangers even sent Sophie new bicycles and toys, though we donated most of them to children's charities since Sophie was still too traumatized to enjoy them. The public attention was overwhelming at first. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews and updates on Sophie's recovery. I had to change our phone number twice and eventually hired a publicist to handle the media requests. The attention wasn't all positive. There were some people who thought I was being vindictive by pursuing such severe legal action against my own sister. Anonymous online commenters accused me of being money-hungry and destroying my family over an accident. But the vast majority of people understood exactly what had happened here. This wasn't about money or revenge, it was about protecting a child and ensuring that there were consequences for inexcusable behavior. Parents from around the country reached out to share their own stories of family members who had hurt their children, and many said that seeing Sophie get justice had inspired them to take action in their own situations. During this time, I also learned more disturbing details about Nicole and Isabella's relationship. During the custody evaluation, it came out that this wasn't the first time Isabella had been violent toward other children. There had been incidents at school where she had hit classmates, destroyed their belongings, and shown a complete lack of empathy when confronted about her behavior. The school had recommended counseling, but Nicole and Michael had dismissed the suggestions, insisting that Isabella was just spirited and that other children were too sensitive. The child psychologist who evaluated Isabella described her as having been raised in an environment of toxic entitlement where she was taught that her wants and needs were more important than anyone else's. Nicole had apparently been telling Isabella for years that she was superior to other children, that she deserved the best of everything, and that it was unfair when other people had things she wanted. The hammer attack on Sophie was the inevitable result of this poisonous parenting philosophy. What made it even more heartbreaking was learning that Isabella had specifically asked Nicole why Sophie got such a nice bicycle when her own bike was older and less fancy. Instead of using this as a teachable moment about gratitude and empathy, Nicole had fed into Isabella's jealousy and resentment. According to witness testimony, Nicole had been overheard telling Isabella earlier in the day that some people just get things they don't deserve and that life isn't always fair, but sometimes we can fix that. The more I learned about what had led up to the attack, the more convinced I became that I had done the right thing by pursuing every legal avenue available. This hadn't been a moment of poor judgment or a parent losing control, it had been a deliberate assault orchestrated by an adult who should have known better, carried out in part by a child who had been weaponized by years of toxic messaging. Nicole and Michael tried to appeal the judgment, claiming it was excessive and that they didn't have the money to pay it. But our attorney had done his homework during discovery. We knew about their assets, their debts, and their attempts to hide money during the legal proceedings. We also knew that Michael had professional liability insurance that would cover at least part of the judgment. The appeals court upheld the verdict, and we began the process of collecting on the judgment. Nicole and Michael were forced to sell their house, their cars, and most of their possessions. Michael's law practice went under because his malpractice insurance was tied up paying our judgment, and he couldn't afford to maintain his office or pay his staff. But the financial ruin was just the beginning of their problems. The assault conviction meant that Nicole now had a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She lost her job at the marketing firm where she'd worked part-time, and she found it nearly impossible to find new employment. Who wants to hire someone who's been convicted of assaulting a child? Michael's legal career was effectively over. The State Bar Association opened an investigation into his conduct, and while he wasn't technically disbarred, his reputation was so damaged that clients stopped coming to him. The legal community is smaller than most people realize, and word travels fast when one of their own is involved in something as heinous as the assault of a child. Isabella was removed from their home temporarily while Child Protective Services conducted their investigation. The psychologists who evaluated her found that she had been raised in an environment where violence and entitlement were normalized. Nicole and Michael had apparently been teaching Isabella that she was better than other children and that she deserved whatever she wanted, regardless of how it affected others. The hammer attack on Sophie wasn't an isolated incident, it was the result of years of toxic parenting. Isabella was eventually returned to Nicole and Michael's custody, but only under strict supervision. They were required to attend family therapy sessions, parenting classes, and regular check-ins with social services. Isabella was also required to attend individual therapy to address her violent tendencies and her entitled attitude. My parents, who had initially dismissed the incident as children playing too rough, were forced to confront the reality of what had happened when they were called as witnesses in both trials. The videos and testimony made it impossible for them to deny that this had been a deliberate and vicious attack on their granddaughter. They were horrified when they realized how close Sophie had come to permanent brain damage or death. The process of testifying was particularly difficult for my mother. She had to sit in that courtroom and watch the video recordings of Sophie being struck in the head with a hammer, and then listen to her own voice dismissing it as rough play. I watched her break down completely during cross-examination when the prosecutor asked her if she still believed that hitting a child in the head with a hammer constituted normal playground behavior. My father was equally shaken. He had always prided himself on being a protective grandfather, but he had to admit under oath that his first instinct had been to protect Isabella rather than help Sophie. The prosecutor pressed him on this point, asking him to explain why he had carried away the perpetrator instead of calling for medical help for the victim. Dad couldn't give a satisfactory answer because there wasn't one. He had failed Sophie in the moment when she needed him most, and he would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of his life. The testimony also revealed some uncomfortable truths about the family dynamics that had led to this point. My parents admitted that they had always treated Nicole differently than me, making excuses for her behavior and enabling her sense of entitlement. They acknowledged that they had been aware of Isabella's behavioral problems but had chosen to ignore them because Nicole became defensive whenever anyone criticized her parenting. My mother testified that she had noticed Nicole becoming increasingly jealous and competitive with me over the years, particularly after Sophie was born. Nicole had made numerous comments about how it wasn't fair that I had such a perfect daughter when she was struggling with Isabella's behavioral issues. Instead of addressing Nicole's obvious mental health problems and encouraging her to seek help, my parents had simply tried to keep the peace by downplaying the severity of the situation. The most damaging testimony came from my Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who had been present at several family gatherings where Nicole had made concerning statements about Sophie. Linda testified that Nicole had once said she wished Sophie would learn that life isn't a fairy tale and that some children get too much attention for being sweet and innocent. Linda had been so disturbed by these comments that she had spoken to my mother about them, but Mom had brushed off her concerns, saying that Nicole was just going through a difficult time. During the civil trial, our attorney also brought in several of Nicole and Michael's former friends and neighbors who testified about the toxic environment in their household. One neighbor described hearing Isabella screaming at other children during playdates, calling them names and threatening to make them sorry if they didn't do what she wanted. Another testified about seeing Isabella deliberately break another child's toy during a birthday party, then laughing when the child started crying. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony from Isabella's former babysitter, a college student named Ashley who had quit after only 3 months. Ashley described Isabella as the most difficult child she had ever cared for, prone to violent outbursts when she didn't get her way. She testified that Isabella had once tried to cut off her younger cousin's hair while he was sleeping during a family visit, and that when confronted about it, Isabella had shown no remorse and had actually seemed proud of what she had done. Ashley also revealed that Nicole had instructed her never to punish Isabella for anything, regardless of her behavior. When Ashley had tried to put Isabella in timeout for hitting a neighbor child, Nicole had fired her on the spot and told her that Isabella was just defending herself and that other children needed to learn not to provoke her. This pattern of behavior painted a clear picture of a family in crisis, where violence and entitlement had been normalized to the point where an 8-year-old felt justified in hitting a 6-year-old in the head with a hammer. The jury was clearly disgusted by what they heard, and several of them were visibly emotional during the more disturbing testimony. The defense tried to argue that Nicole was suffering from postpartum depression and anxiety that had gone undiagnosed for years. They brought in a psychiatrist who testified that Nicole's behavior could be explained by mental illness, and that she should be viewed as a victim rather than a perpetrator. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They pointed out that Nicole had been planning and preparing for the attack, bringing hammers from her own garage specifically for the purpose of destroying Sophie's bicycle. This level of premeditation was inconsistent with a mental health episode. The prosecution also noted that if Nicole was truly suffering from mental illness, she had a responsibility to seek treatment rather than allowing her condition to endanger children. They argued that Nicole's failure to get help for her obvious psychological problems, combined with her decision to actively harm a child, made her more culpable, not less. The family dynamics shifted dramatically after the trials. My parents, feeling guilty about their initial reaction and wanting to make amends, began treating Sophie and me with the respect and attention they had always reserved for Nicole and Isabella. They helped with Sophie's medical expenses and therapy costs, and they made it clear that Nicole was no longer welcome in their home until she made genuine efforts to change her behavior and make amends. Nicole's marriage to Michael didn't survive the stress of the criminal charges, the civil lawsuit, and their financial ruin. They divorced about a year after the incident, with Michael claiming that he'd had no idea about Nicole's capacity for violence and that he couldn't risk his remaining career prospects by staying married to her. Nicole was left essentially alone, divorced, unemployed, homeless, and estranged from most of her family. Sophie, thankfully, recovered physically from her injuries. The concussion healed without any lasting effects, and the hairline fracture in her skull closed properly. She had to wear a protective helmet for several months while her skull finished healing, but the doctors said she was incredibly lucky and that there shouldn't be any long-term physical consequences. The emotional healing took longer. Sophie had nightmares for months after the attack, and she developed a fear of other children that made it difficult for her to play normally. She flinched whenever anyone raised their hand near her head, and she became very possessive of her belongings, afraid that someone else would destroy them. The nightmares were particularly heartbreaking. Sophie would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was coming to hurt her. She would run to my room and refuse to go back to her own bed, insisting on sleeping next to me where she felt safe. For months, I barely got a full night's sleep as Sophie tossed and turned beside me, whimpering in her dreams. During the day, Sophie's personality changed dramatically. The outgoing, trusting child who had welcomed everyone at her birthday party was replaced by a withdrawn, anxious little girl who was afraid of her own shadow. She stopped wanting to play with other children, convinced that they might hurt her if she had something they wanted. When we went to the park, she would cling to my side instead of running off to play on the equipment like she used to. The possessiveness was equally difficult to watch. Sophie would count her toys obsessively, making sure everything was exactly where she had left it. If anything was out of place, even slightly, she would panic and assume someone had been in her room trying to take her things. She started hoarding snacks and small items under her bed, creating little caches of belongings that she could protect and control. School became a major challenge. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was incredibly patient and understanding, but even she struggled to help Sophie adjust to being around other children again. Sophie would sit by herself during lunch, afraid to share her food or toys with classmates who might take them away. During recess, she preferred to stay inside and help the teacher rather than go outside where other children might interact with her unpredictably. The school counselor, Mr. Peterson, worked with Sophie twice a week, using play therapy and art projects to help her express her feelings about what had happened. Some of Sophie's drawings from that time still break my heart, pictures of herself as a tiny figure surrounded by giant, threatening shapes, or images of broken toys scattered around a crying child. In one particularly disturbing drawing, she depicted herself lying on the ground with red crayon marks around her head while stick figures stood nearby doing nothing to help. We worked with an excellent child psychologist named Dr. Catherine Wells who specialized in trauma. Dr. Wells explained that Sophie was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, which was completely normal for a child who had experienced such a violent and unexpected attack. She assured me that with proper treatment and support, Sophie could recover fully, but it would take time and patience. The therapy sessions were intensive and emotionally exhausting for both of us. Dr. Wells used a combination of cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and play therapy to help Sophie process her trauma. I had to learn new parenting techniques to help Sophie feel safe and secure, including creating very structured routines and giving her as much control as possible over her environment. One of the most difficult aspects of Sophie's recovery was helping her understand that what had happened to her was not her fault. Children naturally assume they must have done something wrong when bad things happen to them, and Sophie was convinced that she had somehow deserved to be attacked. She kept asking me if she had been bad or greedy for wanting to keep her bicycle, and whether other children would hurt her if she had nice things. Dr. Wells worked patiently with Sophie to help her understand that Isabella's actions were the result of Isabella's problems, not anything Sophie had done wrong. We used age-appropriate language to explain concepts like jealousy, anger management, and appropriate versus inappropriate behavior. Sophie learned that it was normal and healthy to feel upset when someone destroyed her belongings, and that she had every right to expect adults to protect her from harm. The breakthrough came about 8 months after the attack during a therapy session where Dr. Wells was helping Sophie role-play different scenarios. Sophie was practicing what she would do if another child tried to take her toy, and for the first time since the incident, she stood up straight and said firmly, "No, that's mine, and you can't have it." It was a small moment, but it represented a huge step forward in Sophie's recovery of her sense of personal power and safety. Slowly but surely, she began to recover. The therapy was expensive, but the judgment money from Nicole and Michael meant that I could afford the best possible care for my daughter. Sophie learned coping strategies for her anxiety, and over time she began to trust other children again. About 2 years after the incident, Sophie asked me if we could buy a new bicycle. She said she was ready to try riding again, but she wanted us to pick it out together. We went to the bike shop and spent over an hour looking at different options. She finally chose a beautiful blue and silver bike with a bell and a basket for her stuffed animals. As we walked out of the store with her new bike, Sophie looked up at me and said, "Mommy, this one is even better than my old bike because no one can take it away from me." That's when I knew she was going to be okay. The financial settlement also allowed me to make some major changes in our lives. I was able to put a substantial amount into Sophie's college fund, ensuring that she would have opportunities that I never had. I also used some of the money to go back to school and get my degree in dental hygiene, which led to a better paying job with more flexibility to be there for Sophie when she needed me. We moved to a new neighborhood, farther away from my family's drama, and started fresh. Sophie made new friends who knew nothing about what had happened to her. She joined a soccer team and started taking piano lessons. Slowly but surely, she became a happy, confident child again. As for Nicole, the last I heard, she was living in a small apartment across town, working part-time at a retail job, and still struggling to rebuild her life. She made a few attempts to reach out to me over the years, usually around Sophie's birthday or Christmas, but I blocked her number and returned any letters unopened. Some people might think that's harsh, but I could never forgive someone who had deliberately hurt my child and shown no genuine remorse for their actions. Isabella is now 11 years old, and from what I understand through my parents, she's doing better after several years of intensive therapy. The psychologists worked with her to understand why what she did to Sophie was wrong and to develop empathy for others. My parents say she asks about Sophie sometimes and has expressed regret for what happened, but I'm not ready to expose Sophie to her again. Maybe someday, when Sophie is old enough to make that decision for herself, but not now. The most satisfying part of this whole ordeal wasn't the money or watching Nicole lose everything she valued. It was seeing Sophie recover and thrive despite what had been done to her. She's now 9 years old, confident, kind, and resilient. She stands up for herself and others, and she's learned that sometimes adults make terrible decisions, but that doesn't mean children are powerless. Sophie knows the full story now, in age-appropriate terms. She knows that what her aunt and cousin did to her was wrong, and that there were consequences for their actions. She also knows that I will always fight for her and protect her, no matter what. That knowledge has made her stronger, not weaker. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I overreacted by calling 911 and pursuing both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit against my own sister. But then I remember Sophie lying unconscious on the ground with blood in her hair, and my mother dismissing it as rough play, and I know I did exactly the right thing. Children deserve to be protected, even when the threats come from within their own families. Sophie deserved justice, and thanks to our legal system, she got it. The fact that Nicole's life was ruined in the process is simply the natural consequence of her choices. She chose to assault a child over a bicycle, and she had to face the results of that choice. Sometimes people ask me if I miss having Nicole as a sister, if I regret destroying our family relationships over what they see as a single incident. But what they don't understand is that Nicole's attack on Sophie wasn't a single incident, it was the culmination of years of jealousy, entitlement, and toxic behavior that my family had enabled and excused. Sophie is my priority, always and forever. She deserved better than to be a victim of someone else's dysfunction, and she deserved to see that there are consequences when people hurt innocent children. The money we won in the lawsuit has given Sophie opportunities and security that she never would have had otherwise. She's taking advanced classes in school, participating in enrichment programs, and developing talents that might have gone undiscovered if we'd remained trapped in the cycle of family drama and financial struggle. 3 years later, Sophie still has her blue and silver bicycle, though she's almost outgrown it now. Sometimes I catch her in the garage, carefully cleaning the handlebars and checking the tire pressure, making sure everything is perfect. She takes such good care of her things now, understanding their value in a way that most children her age don't. It breaks my heart a little, knowing that her childhood innocence was stolen by someone who should have protected her, but I'm also proud of the strong, capable person she's becoming. The best revenge, it turns out, wasn't destroying Nicole's life or taking her money. The best revenge was raising Sophie to be everything that Nicole and Isabella weren't: kind, empathetic, resilient, and strong. Sophie will grow up knowing that she has value, that she deserves respect, and that there are people in the world who will fight for her when she can't fight for herself. That's the real victory in this story. Not the prison sentence, not the financial ruin, not the destroyed relationships, but the fact that Sophie survived and thrived despite everything that was done to her. She's a living testament to the power of love, justice, and refusing to accept that some children just play too rough sometimes. In the end, we didn't just get revenge, we got justice. And sometimes, that makes all the difference in the world.